Hey there viewers, welcome back to another episode of Ray of All Trades. Today on the workbench is a Echo CS400 chainsaw. Reported as doesn't start. Let's take a look and see if we can figure out what's going on with it. The thing I noticed is that the chain is extremely loose on it. And the gasoline does not smell very good. Take a peek down on the inside. It's like an OEM fuel filter on there. Throttle works. The start and stop switch appears to work okay. It's got a primer bulb, which is pretty rough looking. So that primer bulb is slow to return. It's also pretty sticky and very discolored. So I definitely want a new primer bulb for it. The air filter is it's also pretty dirty, so I want to get a new air filter for it. Inside the carburetor is actually pretty clean looking. It seems like it's got really good compression. I'm going to pull out the plug and make sure that it's easier to pull over and see if we can take a peek in that cylinder. Let's read the plug while we're at it. Oh, a beautiful brown color on the plug. Running pretty good. Might be a little bit on the lean side, but it's not really white. Feels pretty good pulling it over. I'm not seeing any score marks on the cylinder, at least on the exhaust side. I already know that I'm either rebuilding this carburetor or replacing it, just based on the fact that I'm going to be in there changing out the fuel lines and the primer bulb, because they took a lot of abuse probably from ethanol fuel, or it also could have just been sitting. But I just want to see if it fires off. Let's put a little bit of two-stroke down the carburetor and give it a quick drop. Well, she does fire. Let's get a carburetor, fuel lines, and a new primer bulb for this thing, and see what else we find while we're on the inside. Alright, so this is what we've got. Just checking the fuel lines to see what kind of condition they're in. They don't feel great. I do know we've already established that primer bulb is, well, pretty well shot. And that carburetor, it either needs a rebuild or replacement. Let me see what comes inside the kit that replaces this, the tune-up kit they call it. It's a Chinese aftermarket kit, I'm sure. So if it's got the right pieces and parts, we're just going to go ahead and do it. But I'll take apart the carburetor just to see what it looks like on the inside. So what comes with it? Looks like fuel line assemblies of for a couple different makes. Until I get the carburetor out, I'm pretty sure this is for a string trimmer or the backpack blowers. Comes with a new air filter. Give me a flathead screwdriver. I guess that's for adjusting this carburetor. Aftermarket L7T, so named after the NGK series. Looks like a couple of fuel grommets. Another fuel grommet with 3 leads to it. New fuel filter, new breather, and a couple of carburetor gaskets, and the carburetor. Let's see if this lines up with what it's supposed to be. Yep, so far so good. The only one I can't see is where that hose comes off down there, but we'll find that here in a second. Let's see. So pull this plate back. I'm assuming this is called the air filter base, if I had to guess. Effectively, that's what it's doing. Screw there, and looks like another one on there, and is there another one right here? Appears so. I am going to have to look in my stash and see if anything came with a primer bulb, because they did not include that. And we definitely want to change that on this. So yeah, that's kind of getting cumbersome. Let's see what it takes to pull this out. Pull off your switch. I'm gonna have to pull off the handle cover because it's in my way. It's crazy how tight these screws are in this plastic. I mean, it didn't vibrate loose. I guess that's a good sign, but man, that's pretty tight. Always be careful pulling these off because there is a spring in there. Yep, sure is. Alright, so this spring right here pushes up on this handle. The dead man switch is what that is. This drops in the groove right there, so just pull it out the way. I should be able to pull this loose. I'm rotating this throttle linkage. This one out, rotating it in an outward direction. Let me pull up the primer fuel line. So that one that I just pulled off that goes forward and down goes to the longer lead on the primer bulb. The other one is shooting off that direction to the bottom of the carburetor, and it is the shorter lead. So once this is out, twisting this off of here is much easier. Pull off this. These 2 screws that are holding this air filter base go all the way through the carburetor, so it's also the carburetor mounting bolts too. This thing has got a lot of fuel lines on it. So this is an impulse line off the top. It goes over, and I'm sure it connects to the base of this cylinder. Off the bottom of the carburetor, this L is what goes to the short leg on the primer bulb. And I've got another line. That was the choke lever that just fell. I've got another line coming off the side of the carburetor, going down into the tank, and then the return out of the tank is the long lead to the primer bulb. Before I get too far, because I don't want to lose track of where everything is, let's replace these one at a time. So the first line, new carburetor, it's going to connect here. Let's measure it out, get as close as we can. It's going to come up about there. Give ourselves a little bit of slack just in case. Need to replace this primer bulb. So let me go ahead and find one of these. I'm sure I've got one somewhere. The way you take these out, there's two barbs or two tabs on the inside. Just push those tabs in and it should basically rotate out. Trying to do that on camera and it wasn't working too well. Lo and behold, found one in my stash. You can see the difference there, but the makeup of them is pretty close. I'd be surprised if it wasn't a direct fit. Let's put that to the side and mount this in here so that we can keep track of our fuel lines. It's either that or take pictures or diagrams or something like that to make sure you get it back in the right spot. So the way the last one was, it was mounted like that, and the long one was on the outside edge here. So we're going to put it back in the exact same way. And then, like I mentioned, the one coming off of this side of the carburetor goes to the short side of the primer bulb. Let's just go ahead and hook it up for now. Make sure we don't lose track of it. Once that one's hooked up, we can then remove that fuel line, get it out of our way. Let's make this a little easier to work on. Just pulling the bar off. Now we can see I need to get down to where that fuel line goes into the fuel tank. I should be able to release these two buffer tubes and access it that way. There's plugs right here. I gotta get that plug out of there. There we go. So it looks like a top hat design. And behind that appears to be a Allen wrench. It looks like 3mm Allen wrench. That seemed to give me a little bit of clearance. Alright, now that's out. So both buffer tubes released, lifted it up. It's pivoting on the front buffer tubes right now. I'm going to take a screwdriver and get underneath this grommet. We're going to pull out the fuel lines, the fuel line, the filter, and the return, hopefully all in one shot. Need to mark these because I have to pull them out of here. So what I'm going to do is cut this one at an angle so I know which one it was. Just cut it at an angle just so I can mark it to identify which one it was. Feed them through the body there. Let's see if the filter comes out through this hole. Nope, it doesn't. I'm going to pull the filter out through here. Alright, so let's pull off the fuel filter. I'm changing that out. So that's what I'm looking at. The the one that I cut at an angle went to the top of the carburetor is this line that connects all the way down to the fuel filter. It's a little bit of a sleeve here just to hold things in place. Let's change this one first. That's a pretty close match. You want to make sure that the fuel line is tough going in. Otherwise it's basically going to leak. So let's measure these out. It'll be right about there. Okay, that's my return line. And then the one that was cut at an angle, give myself room for the angle cut. Measure all the way out, right about there. So it's probably going to be a good mark on there, but I'm going to put hemostats on the old fuel line as a marker right up there at that base, so I know how far to pull it in. That looks about right. And if anybody is wondering and has already pulled theirs out, the part inside the tank is about 3 3/4 inside the tank, and above the grommet appears to be 5 1/2. Just in case somebody's already pulled theirs apart and is watching this video to see what I'm doing. All right, so that's what I'm looking at. Like I said, the one with the filter, this one here goes to the carburetor, and the other one should be going to, I think I said the primer bulb. I'm gonna take a peek and see. Let's put this sleeve back on too to line things up. Just like that. Let's run the 2 top ones through the same groove. This groove right here. Through there. In my case, the shorter of the 2 lines, well, in everybody's case, the shorter of the 2 lines is the one that connects to the filter, and it's the one that goes to the top of the carburetor. So I'm going to actually put it in that direction as well, so that the lines don't try to do a twist on them. Not sure it's not that important, but so just fed it up through there. Drop this into the tank. I'm going to need to grab that fuel line. There we go. For those that are wondering why I didn't change that grommet, I have had terrible luck with the aftermarket grommets matching, and it seems like I have much better luck when the grommet's intact using the OEM grommet. It's not a huge deal, but when somebody drops their saw on the side to store it because it happens to be leaking oil or something like that, the fuel is going to come out of that leaking grommet. So when it's in good shape, I try to reuse that same grommet. That fuel line, gently pull it out. We've got ourselves a brand new fuel filter. So when the fuel filter is a much larger diameter like that, and you've got a real tight line on there, I'm going to put it on at an angle, and I'm going to keep pushing down until it opens up enough. You can use a heat source. I recommend not using a flame. because it just melts that hose. So if you can just kind of grin and bear it and do everything you possibly can, up to and including using some sort of a awl or something that has a taper that you can stretch it a little bit, you can do that. Generally, just twisting and massaging it back and forth will usually work. If you're going to use a heat source, you might be able to get away with a heat gun, something like that, or a hair dryer. When it gets too hot though, it starts melting. These metal fuel filters serve two purposes. The fuel filter itself, but it's also made out of metal, and that is the weight that makes it fall into the tank wherever the fuel's at. It helps with siphoning fuel. So we're done there. I'm going to put the buffer tube screws back in. If anybody's wondering, this entire kit ran me probably 18 bucks maybe. Might have been 15 bucks, something like that. It wasn't a lot, and it came with the air filter and everything else. If you're trying to, if you're not a purist and you don't necessarily want to use Echo brand and get away with a something that might need a little tweaking when you first get it started, and you don't mind doing it twice, not a bad way to go. The short line, which was my fuel filter line, remember this one that I cut at an angle, has the filter attachment on the other end, goes right here on the carburetor. The carburetor sits in there like that, but goes around the back side of the carburetor when it's mounted. It's going to mount like that. Make sure you don't have a hard kink in the fuel line. This factory gasket is much better than the one they supplied. It's actually got a foam to it. We're going to reuse that factory gasket, put the impulse line back on. The impulse line on this one feels pretty good. If it didn't, you'd have to take apart the rest of the saw to get to the bottom where it connects. So not opposed to it, it's not needed on this one. The other primer line connects over here to the long port on the primer bulb. Okay, take the throttle linkage, put it in just like that. The plastic, it goes in, this throttle linkage goes into this plastic groove right here to hold it square. Impulse line back on. All the fuel lines are intact, hooked up. My primary lines are both intact, my fuel line's intact. Okay, this gasket here goes on your air filter base plate or mounting plate. I'm going to twist the carburetor to upward position, put the screws in, and then try to get all those pieces all at one time back where they belong. Go slow with that process, because you may have something hung up and you don't want to force anything. So I push the screws all the way in through the carburetor so that so I can see where they're trying to line up on the block, on the cylinder. Once I'm there and everything's moving freely, I'm going to tighten up the screws. Keep checking yourself. Make sure nothing comes loose and you're not binding anything, pinching any fuel hoses or anything like that. Tighten them up evenly. If everything's in there tight like it's supposed to be, then your anchor bolt should line up. Snug it on down. I'm going to line up our plate. Go ahead and attach your wires. So if these wires weren't hooked up, the chainsaw would just run and not be able to shut off. So when that switch is engaged, all it's doing is connecting a circuit from ground over to the coil. The coil utilizes that to stop the spark. Otherwise, without that wire, there's no reason for it to stop. It just basically is going to keep going. Tuck your wires down in. This throttle linkage goes inside between those two barbs right there. I'm not crazy about how this hose is routing right now. I'm going to go ahead and disconnect that hose. Bring it across the bottom because that puts it out of the way of the throttle. Hey, I make mistakes too, right? Back onto the long barb. Okay. Choke goes on like that. Lines up with the other hole in the carburetor. Alright, so the choke rod connects into that hole right there and then drops down into that groove right there. And then this plastic lines up into grooves. There's holes here and here, and then down at the bottom down here there's a slot that it's lining up in. Make sure that the throttle linkage is free, nothing stopping it before you get too far. I rerouted this primer line to go underneath the choke linkage. Seems to line up a lot better that way and get stuff out of the way. Okay, now that that plate's in place, all my fuel lines are not binding. Check my throttle, check my choke, make sure nothing is hitting. Let's put the dead man switch back on. So this spring right here is going to be pressing on that handle, so it keeps it up. Just checking for full throttle throw. Full throttle throw. Alright, so pull this spring over into the side and back down. Pull that spring down with one hand and something like that. That should hold. That should stay up. Throttle should not work until this is pressed. So make sure that that is functioning like it's supposed to. Drop this screw back in. Let's get that plug changed out. Must be the brand name, Top. That's a funny one. If I had an NGK in stock, I would be putting that in right now. I don't. They're on order. Pull that plug out. A lot of these aftermarket spark plugs have a removable electrode on top, and they're always loose. So if you do use them, make sure you tighten it up. Doesn't take much, just make sure it's tight. When I was taking this apart, I had to have that loose. My adjustment screws are in there. They're flathead. Slide the grommet for the spark plug wire into the plastic holder on the casing. Spark plug back in. Yeah, it seals up okay. Not a bad air filter design. I kind of like this. Got a lot of surface area. I'm going to leave off this cover so I can see in here while I'm checking this thing over. I forgot to put in my buffer tubes. Actually, I left them out on purpose because I wasn't sure if I was going to have to go back in there or not. Let's go ahead and get those in place. So far so good. Can't even tell I gave this thing a bath. Half a tank of fuel. So the first thing we want to verify, does it prime fuel? The answer is yes. Let's see if we can just make it run. So pull the choke. It's in the run position. Fired off. I'm going to turn the choke off. Looks like she's a little bit off. Turn up that idle speed just a little bit. I'm going to check that low jet real fast, just see where it's at. So you count your turns in. Half. One. It's like 1.5. Alright, let's talk about a valuable lesson. So, this right here is my oil passage. Right? So this oil passage has to line up with this hole in the bar right here, the small one. The small one right here. I'll try to point to it. This one right here. Not these big oval ones, but this one down here. Has to line up with those. So when you go to the store to buy a bar, there's a few things you have to know. Does it fit the bar? Does it fit the chainsaw? And when they ask the type of model and everything, what they're referring to, or what they want to know, is how far apart these studs are. Does it have a shoulder on it? How far away this oil passage is, And you'll see why here in just a second. So if I take a measurement, and because of the camera I'm not going to be able to show you guys that well, if I take a measurement from the bottom of the stud up to the center of that oil passage, right? So that right there, I'm on the bottom of the stud and I'm at the center of the oil passage, right there, locked it in. So I do the same thing here. I line up the bottom of the stud, which would be so the stud goes in the middle of this bar, and I line up the oil passage. Look how far away we are from that oil passage. Oil would have never reached that chain. So there's a few reasons why the bar wouldn't tighten up. Number one is where these holes are in relation to the studs. And I was trying to figure out why I couldn't get all of the distance out of here. And it's because this is the wrong bar. The other thing you need to know, on the bar itself, they come in various widths. So this is well, it's not even stamped on here. I have to look up the part number. It's 1044208. But what that has to correlate to is this distance right here, the chain, where the chain rides. It's either going to be a 0.5, a 0.58, a 0.63. I think there's another one, 0.4 something. Anyway, and then finally the sprocket. It's designed for a 3/8 or a 325 or a 404. Yeah, there's a couple more. I'm just drawing a blank right now. But I've talked about this in the past. I've got a mess here. I just happen to be discovering this all at one time. So if you've got a, let's see, quarter, 325, 3/8, or 404, and it tells you on here how to measure it, right? So you're lining up, this is actually a 3/8 bar, so you're lining up those two pinholes, that one and that one. So this is a 3/8 chain. So if I tried to use the 325 to do the same thing, you would see that it centers on the back one, but it cuts off the front one. So that's what this tool is used for. So it's designed to line up the two rivets. So one on the back side of here and one on the front side here. So I know that it's a 3/8 chain. So the bar and the chain will probably match up when you buy them as a set. If not, you'll need to know that. But the bar also has to match the saw, and in this case it does not. So that chain, had it mounted, the chain would have burned up almost immediately because it wouldn't have been throwing any oil. I did promise you guys that I would take apart that carburetor so you can see what was going on inside it. It was super easy just to change everything out. But hey, a promise is a promise, right? Let's put those on there for now. Go ahead and get this cover on. And I'm going to look up a CS400. And the bar that was on it was a 3/8 bar and chain. And the sprocket didn't have any excess wear, so I'm going to see if the CS400 came with a 3/8 sprocket, and if it did, I'll go ahead and get that ordered. Let's put this out of the way for a minute. Let's see what was inside this carburetor. Just in case somebody wants to disassemble theirs and try to put a kit in it. The thing is, the kits usually cost about $7 to $12. But at the end of the day, you have an OEM carburetor that likely the adjustments would be correct on. So, well, Guarantee this one would not have worked. That metering diaphragm, it doesn't move at all. I might be able to get it off here so you guys can see it. I haven't seen one that bad for a while. If you are rebuilding one, the gasket would go on first, then the metering diaphragm with the large circle facing down. But yeah, this doesn't move at all. Matter of fact, when I try to move it, it's cracking. So at a minimum, it needed a carburetor rebuild. It is a Walbro carburetor, and they are rebuildable. So these holes on this part of the carburetor are passage holes, right? What they do is they push and pull air through this section, and these act like reed valves. These little flaps open and close, and right now they're in the bent position, like they're going to stay that way. They need to be able to move back and forth rapidly. So, and then the way this side of the carburetor goes on is the membrane part goes against this body, and then the gasket material goes on top. And I'll never get these apart so that you can see, but my only word of advice is make sure you line up the gasket with the body of the carburetor. Clean those up, and then inside this hole right here is a screen, and this is the internal filter inside that carburetor, and it's just a screen mesh. Change those out, use a 9/32 drill bit to push them back in. Run these through an ultrasonic cleaner. I like to pull the plugs out, the adjustment, the high-low adjustment screws. I like to pull them completely out, boil the whole thing in the ultrasonic, and get it all cleaned up. Like I said, it was the same cost to replace the entire thing as it would have been to rebuild it, and it came with all of the other pieces that I needed. But hey, promise is a promise. Okay, viewers, we were talking about the bar, the oil hole for the bar being way outside of scope on this CS400 Echo. Finally got the new organ bar in for it. It is there's a couple bars available for this thing. This one is the Oregon part number 39272. It is a 3/8 inch drive because they have a 325 drive, but I'm going off of the clutch sprocket in here. So I ordered the bar and chain to match that clutch sprocket. For this one's a 3/8 drive. So I ordered that combo, and I get it bolted up. So the oil hole is right there. The oil passage on this one comes out of the adjustment screws, the adjustment holes, and you'll see if I line this up, try to get you guys in there. If you line this up, you can see the oil passage inside that hole. It's right there. It's right at the top there. So, and then there's a groove inside the bar. So if I put the paper clip inside the bar, you can see that the paper clip comes right through there. So the oil comes out of there, up through this hole. Since the plate's on the outside to stop it, the oil travels up this hole, and as the chain is passing through, it picks up oil.